I serve a risen Savior, He's in the world today. I know that He is living, whatever men may say. I see His hand of mercy, I hear His voice of cheer. And just the time I need Him, He's always near. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, salvation to impart. You ask me how I know He lives. He lives within my heart. In all the world around me, I see His loving care. And though my heart grows weary, I never will despair. I know that He is leading through all the stormy blasts. The day of His appearing will come at last. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, salvation to impart. You ask me how I know He lives. He lives within my heart. Rejoice, rejoice, O Christian, lift up your voice and sing. Eternal hallelujah to Jesus Christ the King, the hope of all who seek Him, the help of all who find. None other is so loving, so good and kind. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, salvation to impart. You ask me how I know He lives. He lives within my heart. Song for lesson page 395, 395. I traveled down a lonely road, and no one seemed to care. The burdens on my weary back had bowed me to despair. I often complained to Jesus how folks were treating me. And then I heard Him say so tenderly, my feet were also weary upon the Calvary's road. The cross became so heavy, I fell beneath the load. Be faithful, weary pilgrim, the morning I can see. Just lift your cross and follow close to me. I work so hard for Jesus, I often boast and say, I sacrifice a lot of things to walk the lift your cross and follow close to me. Oh Jesus, if I die upon that corn field someday, would be no more than love thee, man, no less could I repay. No greater love than mortal man than for a friend to die. These are the words he gently spoke to me. If just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. But if by death to living they can thy glory see, I'll take my cross and follow close to thee. Pardon him, those page 957, 957, we saw here for us, brother. Oh. You're wearing the right color. I don't know why somebody wears purple today. Y'all do know the dogs won, right?
I'm blaming it on colorblindness that I don't have.
Huh?
No, your microphone.
Oh, you come to the color, I thought you pointed at your red shirt.
No, microphone.
Yeah, I know, they were both red, you know. Going with red and black.
Here for the red and white.
Huh?
Here for the red and white.
Red, white, and black, that's the, red and black, actually. Carol, I went, huh?
Not on.
Something's not on? Which one's not on? This on? Can you hear me now, Ray?
Paul said that you came on.
Oh, okay. I think it was mine, I think it was buzzing back there, I don't know. We're all confused, you know. Oh, man. No takers on this Georgia thing, huh? I'm happy, y'all. We're from Louisiana. You're back. Huh? Do what?
I said we're delighted, we just didn't know how far we should take that conversation.
Oh, okay. Well, I hadn't had anybody brag to the St. George, you know, it's hard. I took Gerald Bessie yesterday and he put on a Georgia hat and I was teasing him about it. And he's like, I didn't even know what that stood for. Somebody gave me a box of hats and I said, you pick the best one out. Oh, okay, well, we'll get back to our study. Old Testament types, New Testament antitypes. You know, there are a lot of things when you start comparing and look at them, and, you know, the temple veil and Christ's death. Now, how would the temple veil and Christ's death be associated with the I see Ron's already on. What? That's what I did too when I first looked at it. Any ideas? What was the veil?
It was in the holy holies that were separated from outside to inside. This way all people know have difference in Christ.
We know it ripped. So
No, we're going to get to that.
okay, sorry.
Paul and Ray were talking about that it actually separated the most holy place from the holy place. And
that was a thing. Who could go into the most holy place? Only the high priest. Once a year. That was the other thing. He could only go once a year. What they used to do to him, do you know? Put a rope on him. Why?
If he died while he was in there, they could pull him out.
In case he died while he was in there, they could pull him out. You know, they didn't want to go in after him. And so, that kind of that point, it was a place to be. In fact, God had warned for them not to go in there just at any time, or they could lose their life. Now notice, here's the command in Exodus 26, and oftentimes we say just the temple had it, but it was in the tabernacle as well. You shall make a veil woven of blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine woven linen. It shall be woven with an artistic design of cherubim. You shall hang it upon the 4 pillars of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. Their hooks shall be gold upon 4 sockets of silver. And you shall hang the veil from the clasp. Then you shall bring the ark of the testimony in there behind the veil. The veil will be a divider for you between the holy place and the most holy. You shall put the mercy seat upon the ark of the testimony in the most holy. You shall set the table outside the veil, and the lampstand across from the table on the side of the tabernacle toward the south, and you shall put the table on the north side. Now, I'll stop there. Okay, so what else was in behind the veil? What was in the most holy place? I think that gets important. Ark of the Covenant. What was on top of the Ark of the Covenant? The mercy seat. When the priest went in there that once a year on the Day of Atonement, what did he do? He sprinkled blood a lot more than what anybody could ever imagine upon that mercy seat. And what was that for? Atonement of sins. Okay? That makes it important. Now, Teresa brought up something here from that happened upon the cross, or at the time, and that's the thing that we do need to think about, the veil having to do with Jesus' death to one point, but also what Jesus' death did. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, from Matthew's account, these resurrections took place after his resurrection. It's kind of a commentary. But the veil split at the time that he died. What's important about the veil being ripped from top to bottom? God's word. Why? How do you know?
It was very tall.
Huh?
It was very tall, and you couldn't reach the top. Men would have torn it from the bottom.
Men would have torn it to the bottom. It was proof that God tore it because it was from top to bottom. How tall was the veil in the temple? Not quite, but close. It would be like somebody being able to reach up to this pillar and pull something out. Not going to do it without a ladder or something. It's just not going to happen. It is not sure what the peak of this building is, but I know the Sistine Chapel is built on the scale of the temple. And you're right, Don, it's about 30 feet. And so when you think about that, and that veil hanging from top to bottom, and it's important that we think about this point of Jesus' death, the veil separating man from God's mercy seat. And that's a big difference, or a big thing to think about. Notice in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, for he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from two, thus making peace. There's a lot that goes in there. What's the big problem with the Old Testament covenant? In fact, the patriarchal covenant. What's the big problem with those two? Couldn't take away sin. There's no way a person can live up to the demands perfectly. They just kept rolling over. Well, they were all pushing forward to Christ's death, and not for Christ's death, it wouldn't even matter that they were pushed forward. That's what it comes back to. The other part of it is, man was always in a separation. He was always in a separation from God. Even the ones that were trying to follow God, there was that separation between the mercy seat and man. When the high priest went in there, what was the first thing he had to do? Had to cleanse himself. And what else did he have to do after he cleansed himself? He had to make a sacrifices for his sins. And then he had to make a sacrifice for the people's sins. So it's always a separation. And notice he goes forward, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who are far off and those who are near, and through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. Now, as we think about this point is the whole thing of Christ dying, that opened it up to where we have access to the mercy seat. How many times did the priest make those sacrifices? 1,500 or more, right? Year after year after year after year after year after year. How many times did Christ make a sacrifice? Just once. Once for all time. That's something to think about. You know, God had that plan. Ron, you look like you got a thought, a question, a statement. Oh, okay. All right. Thought you had something to add. So, we have an access now that previously no one had. Previously before the cross. Hebrews 4:14 through 16, it says, seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but is in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Now, I want to ask you a question. Who was able to go into the holy place? High priest. Why was it called a mercy seat?
It's a judgment seat. That's where the judge sits and determines whether you're guilty or innocent.
That's where you can get mercy, because that's where the judge sits. Who's the judge? So this becomes real important here, because you're trying to approach God. Only the priest could do it, but only the high priest could do it, but only then if he cleansed himself, if he made atonement, if he did everything for himself and then make atonement for the people, he's trying to approach God. That's why he put the rope around him, because if he sinned in the presence of God, what was going to happen? God was going to strike him. All right, well, that would be a sin if he didn't follow the priest. So notice, as he says here, he's tempted, we are yet without sin. That's why it makes him perfect to offer the sacrifice. Notice what it says. let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. What does that tell us?
Blood of Christ works.
Blood of Christ works, but what are we able to do
We can
that no one under the law of Moses except the high priest could do?
approach that mercy seat in heaven.
Approach that mercy seat in heaven, and we can do it boldly. That tells you the high priest wasn't able to do it boldly. Because of our high priest, because of his death.
Our sins were forgiven and theirs were simply temporarily forgotten.
I like grace, but they were temporarily forgotten. There's a point there, were they forgiven?
Impossible for bulls to go to take away sin.
Okay, so that didn't forgive them. What forgave them?
Christ, the blood of Christ.
Christ's blood.
Going back.
So going backwards. But when were they forgiven?
On the cross.
So where was Abraham until Christ came? I'm just bringing up the thought, folks.
Well, now Christ will describe it
That-
loosely in heaven. Whatever, how you want to take it. In the bosom of Abraham, we find the bear.
Okay, now, so here's a thought to consider.
Christ wasn't dead.
Christ wasn't dead. But in the mind of God, how sure was it that Christ was going to die?
100%.
Yeah.
It's his plan.
100%.
His plan was.
So all those things. Have you ever read where it speaks of the saved? Anywhere in the New Testament of the saved? Not gonna be saved, but the saved, past tense. So we have to understand that God knows who's going to be saved. It's a surety to him because he's foreseen everything. So that's where we get in problems. That's where people get problems once saved, always saved, because they see that terminology in past tense saved. But yet Paul tries to find, we have yet to obtain it. We don't know what we're going to do. God knows what we're going to do. Not that God forces us into a description, but he knows our decision. Think about John. When John sees the judgment, he saw everybody be judged. He might have not known who you and I were, but he saw us judged. I'm pretty sure that was pretty overwhelming for John. But that's the same thing. Even though those sins were pushing forward, it was the blood of Christ reaching back. But I have come to the opinion, okay, now notice that, I have come to the opinion or conclusion that that blood was reaching back and cleansing them because they were faithful to do that, that God foresaw they would be faithful, and therefore it was reaching back and cleansing them when they died.
That is Al's opinion.
That is Al's opinion. Okay? I want to make that stress. So if you have a different opinion, it's okay. You can be wrong.
You may be right. There's a lot about that we don't know.
There's a lot we don't understand, but we do know this. If we take that glimpse of Abraham, and Jesus mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we pretty well know that at the time that Christ was on earth, he was considered saved. Lazarus, the beggar, was in his bosom, but the rich man was in torment. And that's the only way I can rectify those. The fact of it was, the blood of bulls and goats was never going to bring forgiveness except for the blood of Christ. and it did reach back. When, I don't know.
We know his thoughts and his ways are not our thoughts and our ways, but we do know it's in the Bible for a reason, and it's so we wouldn't be sitting around going, well, did those people not be saved? We know they were saved. We know the blood will work both directions.
Yeah, and I don't think that they were in torment for a minute. And as one guy tried to convince me that they were all in torment right up until when Christ died, and then they got moved over into paradise. In fact, let me ask this question. What did Abraham tell the rich man on that thought right there?
You can't cross over.
You can't cross over. Yes, ma'am.
Looking at this and seeing that the bells ring, et cetera, and high priest, how is it that there is another religion that still deals with the priest? And people go to this particular situation where they think that, why do they think that they have the power and the people don't to do their own prayers and still praying eternal prayers to, I'm trying not to get too intense and all this.
I understand.
Someone else, but yet if you try to question or ask them, boy, howdy, you can just tear up against this.
Yeah, and here's one way. Take this,
Okay.
seal it up, put it in a language that no one understands, and what do they have to do?
Exactly.
They have to rely upon you to tell them what it means. That's why this was originally put into Latin. What was Koine Greek? The common Greek, the common language. What was Latin? We oftentimes think that it was the language of Rome or the empire, but it was not. Italian was the language of Italy even back then. Latin was the language of the higher educated in and around Rome.
But that carried forward even years into our time. I remember going.
Well, what happens when you teach people that continuously, even after the language is brought out? In fact, who was the first person to translate the language as far as we know, or translate the Bible out of Latin? As far as we know. Luther. And what did they want to do to Luther? They wanted to kill him. Why? Because they didn't want people to have it. They did not want them to have access to it, because once they had access to it, what does it do? They lose control. People can read it. People can start to understand it if they want to. The problem is too many people want to rely upon somebody to tell them what it says instead of looking for themselves to see what it says. So it's easy to start convincing them. Once you start perpetrating that over and over again for generation and generation, what does it become true to those people? They can puff it, but the truth of it, it becomes the truth to them. They follow who they are. So you get this point, and they don't ever read those scriptures like in 2 Peter or 1 Peter, where Paul says we are a royal priesthood. What does that mean if we're a royal priesthood? If we're all priests, what do we have? Access to the high priest, access to God. See, there's a lot of problem with that idea, because it says that the priest can absolve you of your sins. Who can absolve? It's kind of contradictory, because what did the Pharisees realize? Think about that lame man in Mark chapter 9. When Jesus tells him, your sins be forgiven you, what did they say? Who are you? You only God can forgive sins. Then what did he do? He healed him. Why did he heal him? To prove that he was able to forgive the sins, because if he could do the one they could see, he could do the one that they could not see. At that moment, they should have known that he was the Son of God. So, how is it? The devil likes to deceive, and he's good at it. And people that are willing to, somebody, statement got in today, brought in discussion, and the point I made was people are always telling me, well, my preacher says, when you start discussing what the Bible says. You know what my response usually is to them? And that's what, and I've had people tell me when I get to judgment, I won't tell God, hey, this is what my preacher told me. Because that's usually about where the conversation's going. And I said, I usually tell them, well, you know what God's going to do? He's going to look at you. We're going to get to him in a minute, but right now we're talking about you. We're not going to be able to say, so-and-so told me, or I thought, or I understood. God's going to sit there and go, what did we do? How did we handle it? So, does that answer your question? Okay. The holy place. What was the holy place in the temple? We just talked about you had the most holy place and you had the holy place. They're separate. What was in the holy place? Lampstands, candles,
Incense.
the basins to wash. Who was able to go into the holy place? Only the priest. Only the priest.
It's a common room for preparation.
There was common room for preparation, and sometimes we get to think that the altar was in there, but the altar was actually in the courtyard. The people could see the altar, people could go into the altar, but the people could not go into the holy place. That was reserved for the priest. And then you had the most holy place that was reserved for the high priest, so to speak. Only he was allowed to go in. So, how is the church related to the holy place?
Same thing, just priest go with it.
The only priests go with it. The only priests are part of it. Notice this, Exodus 38-21, you shall also make a laver of bronze with its base also bronze for washing. You shall put it between the tabernacle of meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it. For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet in water from it when they go into the tabernacle meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to burn up an offering made by fire to the Lord, and they shall wash with water lest they die. So they shall wash their hands and their feet lest they die, and it shall be a statute forever to them, to him and his descendants throughout their generations. That brings a part of the veil. What did the ripping of the veil signify? Since we went through that. It exposed all that to the people, but it also signified the end of that covenant as it was written with them. There's that point. This is going to be different. It's a new covenant. It's different. But there's something else. You know.
There's a new priest.
Well, there's a new high priest, but I want you to look at this. What did the priests what were they always constantly doing? Washing. Was it just to get the germs off? Nothing to it. They didn't even know what germs were.
It was a ritual.
It was part of the ritual, but they had to do it in order to be able to be in the Holy Place. This was a command from God. did a study a while back on God's use of water, baptism, how he's always used water. Notice that the priests had to be cleansed before they could go into the holy place. In 1 Timothy 3:14-15. These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly, but if I'm delayed, I write so that you may know how ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth. When we come into worship as a church, who do we come before? Jesus, God, Holy Spirit. We're approaching the throne of God. There's reality. So as Christians, what do we need to do before we can be in that priestly area? Wash.
One time.
Wash. Need to be washed in the blood. Why is it so hard for us to figure that out? When you go back and you see them washing constantly, now I will go one other step forward. To our worship be accepted, we need to make sure that we're cleansed. So when we get washed, we did have that relationship with God where if we're walking the light, see his light, the blood of his son continually cleanses us from all sin. What does that mean? That means if we're being faithful to confess to him our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and we're acceptable in our worship.
So prayer plays into our washing.
Prayer plays into our washing, but only if we've had the initial washing
One time.
of the baptism.
But the continual washing to be linked into prayer.
It is. It's definitely linked into prayer. And it's linked into living faithfully.
But you cross over at baptism.
But you cross over, you enter that priesthood at baptism. That's the initial washing. But you continue in that priesthood in the continual cleansing.
Walking in the light.
Walking in the light. They're tied together. You can't do one without the other. But we don't have to go through that every time we come to worship. But we are able to go through that prayer and make sure we're right before God.
Our prayers could be linked to what the high priest had to do when he went by the labor.
When he went by the labor, he had to cleanse, they had to burn the incense. What does Revelation say about our prayers?
Like the incense fragrance coming up the wrong when it rises up.
A sweet smelling aroma. Gives the analogy that they are lanterns of incense. And it even says, which are our prayers. Kind of tells you what those harps are when you see them.
It is so sad that many people are mistaken because they don't see it, or they're willing to be misled without looking into it themselves. But I think there's going to be a lot of people that are be surprised at the judgment, but also not only those who taught them, but were taught as well.
It is sad. I think it's true that we are sheep. Ron?
Maybe I misunderstood. When we come into here, into this building, we're not coming into the most holy place before God.
No, that's not what I'm saying. When we come together as a church to worship, and even in being part of the church,
What about the people that are non-Christians, that are visitors, or non-Christian people that are among us?
priest, okay?
So where you say they're not allowed?
No, I'm not saying they're not
They were
allowed.
strangers, they were strangers with, the Israelites, they carried strangers with them.
Look,
It could be likened to that.
yeah, it could be likened to a stranger. What I am saying is, when we worship as a church, as God has ordained for us to worship as priests, cleansing, our worship is acceptable. What about theirs? I had somebody one time say that we should not allow people to take the Lord's Supper. Why? Why would you not allow someone to take the Lord's Supper that's not a member of the church?
Some would say for fear that they would be damned.
They're drinking damnation unto themselves, okay? You know what my reply is? If you're already damned, how much more damned can you be?
But that's a part, I'm just saying that.
I understand, but that's exactly the reason that they will give. And it comes back to this point, if they're already damned, how much more damned can they be? And what do I do when I sit there and say, hey, you can't take this? What's going to happen then?
Offend them and drive them away.
Offend them and drive them away.
If they're coming, there's a hope for safety.
If they're coming, there's a hope of teaching.
That's right, remember the bleeding, the corners again.
Yeah.
Corners again.
It may lead to their forgiveness. It may lead to their salvation. So there's no way I can restrict them. It's a question of whether or not God accepts their worship. I'm not going to stop them from trying, because that's not my job. It's a weaken the terrorist. Let's be honest, sometimes we get the wrong idea. Is everybody in the church going to be saved? Just being a part of the church isn't going to save you. It's living faithfully. That's the point of the weaken the terrorist.
Earthly term for that is open and closed communion.
Yeah, the earthly term is open and closed communion.
There are some groups that practice closed communion, and they have to be in their church.
Yeah. And that led to a man back in the 1800s, because he was told to close communion, and they were the only church in the local area. And his deal of it is, well, we accept everybody that comes in and say one faith is as good as another. How can we close the communion? And that led to him studying, and he realized everything he had been taught was wrong.
It was predicated on false teaching.
Yeah, predicated on false. And he said, if we're that exclusive, if something's supposed to be exclusive, what makes it exclusive? And he went to the Bible. And he even came to the conclusion that they didn't have a right to close communion to begin with. But they did have to be acceptable. Anybody have an idea who that man was? Not quite. One generation forward. No, Thomas Campbell, Alexander's father.
Apostle Paul talks about the fact that our worship ought to be understandable. It ought to be simple enough so that people can understand. Because he does talk about the fact that ungifted or one outside will come in and they understand it. They fall down and worship the same God's among them.
It is. He said God's author of peace, not confusion. But he also made this point, let a man examine himself. That's why we don't have a right to close communion. We don't have a right to tell somebody they can't worship here. We don't have a right, as long as they're willing to do what, be respectful of us, just to shut out anybody. Because God said, let a man examine himself.
And it's also a teaching moment.
It is a teaching moment. And you're never going to win anybody telling them you can't come in.
That's one reason speaking in tongues and so on, prophecy is much better because people can understand.
Well, we can go into that all night.
Well, I didn't mean to go into that.
But I understand, but I can go into that. Let's get back to our point of the church. Notice in Hebrews 12, 22, 24. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spiritual just men made perfect, to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Who's going to be in the Lamb's Book of Life? Did y'all catch that? The church. Notice that, the General Assembly and Church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven. Where are they registered at?
Book of Life.
In the Book of Life. Here's a question along that examine ourselves. I had somebody said that when we sing the song, when we all get to heaven, we ought to change it to when the saved get to heaven. My question to them was, are you not part of the saved?
Well, only all that are saved.
Well, I mean, we're intended for, if we're here, our hope is to be part of the saved. I mean, that's my plan. And when you start segregating, they're saying, well, there's a possibility somebody may not be saved, and we may be encouraging them to lie. Okay, there again, what are we supposed to do? Examine ourselves. And you know what? What he brought up right there a few minutes ago, what Dwayne brought up, teaching moments. Who's to say that if somebody's not living right, that singing a song like that might not prick their heart to where they make it where they are going to heaven?
If you spend your time trying to nitpick and find the negativity, then you're gonna wipe out all chances of those teaching moments. And then people are gonna think, well, what is the use?
There you go. If you get so negative and everything, we gotta at some point point out the good to the point. We do have to admit the negative to a point, but we can't get so nitpicky that we can't even stub our toe and still be saved.
I can honestly say I know a church in Mississippi that this conversation went on about the words in the songs. They were deleting songs and would not let those songs be sung in church because they did not agree with it. They thought that was wrong, and I thought, oh my goodness.
Here's the truth. Are there things that probably shouldn't be sung?
Well, there's lessons, lessons in song, and it's a teaching thing.
Well, that's what we're doing, teaching and honest song. Are there probably songs that aren't fit to be sung in church?
Yeah.
Yes, there probably are. And some of them might even be in our songbook, okay? But here comes reality though. But if I go to from one extreme to the other extreme, am I any better than that side? I've got to be careful. I'm not saying we can't say certain songs shouldn't be sung. In fact, who has the authority to determine that? God, and who? Who has he given that authority on earth?
Elders.
Elders. Elders. Okay? Now, even some of the wrong songs give teaching moments. I think sometimes what we try to do is release the song leader from his responsibility to make sure that the songs are scriptural. Because if he's the one choosing the songs, he ought to be making sure that what they say is true. He has that responsibility.
It's kind of like the NIV. I used to tell people don't use the NIV, but there's a learning moment in that because, like we're talking about, you can see some of the things in there compared to the formal translation. Then that's another teaching moment. So, yeah.
Well, and I've often said, and I don't think most people realize, the NIV is a thought translation versus a word-for-word translation.
And it also a dynamic, as they call it.
Yeah. And I don't know if the newer versions do, but the old versions used to have that in the prefix, that it was a thought translation.
But some people take some of those notes on the side for inspiration also.
Well, you know, and here's the truth. When Thompson did his New King James, he did that, he took that too, and he had a lot of commentary in there that didn't fit the scriptures of the New King James. So, let's see something. I don't know if we're gonna get through that part.
And Alan, I think with everything, you know, the main thing is to remember that the church, we the people, the whole goal every day, besides trying to help people be saved, is to remember the church is to be pure. And that's what we should always try to do, is to keep it clean.
And that's a good point, because when did the priest stop being priest? When they died? That's when the high priest was. There's a point there. When do we stop being priests? When we die. When do we stop being a part of the church?
No, not ever.
Not ever. Not ever. Now, here, the point in that not ever, what happens when we go out the door? We're still members of the church, we're still priests, we're still representatives of God's people. So how should we act out there versus in here?
Why would it be any different?
It's not supposed to be any different. It's not supposed to be any different. We are going to stop with the holy place. We'll pick up with the most holy place in 2 weeks. This is getting a lot longer planned between me having COVID and we got this teaching next Wednesday. Michael is. What you teaching about?
Discipleship.
Discipleship, okay, as long as you're not messing with the holy place. That is, what is a disciple?
Find out next week.
Find out next week. Look that up, make sure he teaches it.
Watch it online.
Huh?
So you can watch him online.
I'd have to watch afterwards. And then speaking of that, the lectureships themselves will be online, live stream from fsop.net, Florida School of Preaching.net.
I see my buddy over there.
He's not on lectureship this year.
Right now, okay.
But that don't mean he might not lead a prayer, so I don't know. But yeah, he might be, he's still, and it is on the resurrections. They're doing something new this year. They're having day care for the kids with classes. So, they got people doing that together. So you're welcome to join me. It starts at 9 o'clock Eastern time, Monday morning. So usually takes a few minutes for them to get it up, green. So, but I intend to print off a flyer and put it on the bulletin board, so if anybody's interested. Any other thoughts or questions? Along those lines, we got an invitation song, as we always do, because that's the point of it is, there's that point of that cleansing, an opportunity to get right with God. So if anyone needs any prayers or anything, we'd ask to meet you back as we stand and sing.
This world is not my home.
I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue.
Savior born in me, and now I onward go. I know He'll take me through, though I am weak and poor, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Just up in glory land we'll live eternally. The saints on every hand are shouting victory. Their song of sweetest praise reels back from heaven's shore, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel